Howdy guys, welcome to another video. Today we're gonna watch all the countries that the United Kingdom or Great Britain has invaded throughout history. Let's watch. Alright, I'm excited about this one. I feel there's gonna be a lot of countries, including mine, which is Mexico. Without further ado, let's start watching.
Watch all of my videos early and ad-free, or watch my upcoming original series exclusively on Nebula, which you can get access to for $15 a year through the bundle.
By the way, I had Nebula and it's a little bit overrated. It's not that
for
cool.
A good chunk of the past few centuries, this music
Gracious Queen,
people across the entire world. The English and later the British have been responsible for invading and conquering more countries and people than any other nation in human history. And honestly, it's startling just how many places they've been to. In this video, I'm going to do my best at attempting to visualize all of Britain's invasions and conquests for you, continent by continent, in as brief a time as possible.
Okay,
so
France, that's gonna be a lot of invasions.
Ireland was the first target of British conquests and was invaded as early as 1169. Within 400 years of gradual conquests, the entire island was ruled by the British and remained that way until most of it was granted independence in 1921. Historically, France has probably been invaded by the English more times than any other country in the world. Just take a look at this huge list of invasions.
Man, look at that. Yeah, there's not enough time. And the invasion of Brittany, of course. A lot of these I don't know. 7 Years' War, the War of Austrian Succession, the War of Spanish Succession, okay, the Anglo-French Wars, the 100 Years' War. Okay, yeah, there's plenty. I think right now Britain and France have a very close friendship relationship, but it's hard to forget that it wasn't always like that.
About a third of these, and for a time, all of this territory inside of modern France was directly controlled by the English, with Calais being the final piece that fell in 1557. Well, except for that time when the British took over Corsica for a couple years. The British continue to invade Spain by
the motherland.
But in the past, they've come with a lot less
as well as pirates.
English and later British soldiers invaded under the Black Prince in 1367 and continued on through the first, second,
and Gibraltar, of course,
raids on Cadiz, and that time when the British took over Gibraltar and Minorca. They gave Minorca back, but decided on keeping Gibraltar.
They kept Gibraltar, man.
In history, the British have invaded Belgium in order to support the Belgians. But that wasn't always the case. They conducted two pretty large-scale invasions of modern-day Belgium in 1654 and again in 1701. And Flanders itself was ruled by the English for a few years in the 14th century. The Netherlands was one of England's historical arch rivals, and so there's been plenty of invasions going in this direction across the 17th and 18th centuries. In 1940, the British technically invaded and took over Iceland peacefully for a year in order to...
But it was more of a friendly invasion, wasn't it?
It was heavily protested by the Icelandic government at the time, so in my books it still counts as an invasion. Italy, of course, was invaded by the British Army during the Second World War as well in 1943, but there were plenty of invasions before then, dating back to Richard Bonaparte invasion in 1190. Germany,
the Napoleonic Wars, of course,
obviously invaded by the British Army in 1945.
Hanover.
Western Germany was occupied by the British for 3 years until 1948, but a lot of German...
World War II really influenced a lot of these. I'm guessing in Europe and Asia, but it's still. Britain was very involved a long time before that.
The islands of Heligoland were British for most of the 19th century, and the Kingdom of Hanover was effectively ruled under a personal union for over a century between 1714 and 1837. Austria was also invaded in 1945, and the southwest of the country was occupied for a decade. Norway was invaded in 1810 and 1812 during the Napoleonic Wars when it was a part of Denmark-Norway because Denmark was aligned to France, so obviously Denmark was invaded during that time as well. Finland, Estonia, and Latvia were all briefly invaded by small units during the Crimean War against Russia because they were all part of the Russian Empire at the time, and of course, Russia itself was invaded then too, as well as in 1918 when the British took over a large chunk of northern Russia for a time in their fight against the Bolsheviks. The territory of modern Ukraine was invaded by British Army units during the Crimean War. The British took over the Croatian island of Vis between 1807 and 1814 during their fight against Napoleon. The British Army had boots and guns on the ground in Bosnia recently between 1992 and 95 fighting against the Bosnian Serbs, and around the same time the RAF also carried out bombing strikes against Serbian Serb targets in Serbia in 1999. Montenegro was briefly blockaded and invaded in 1913 during the First Balkan War. The British owned the westernmost Ionian islands of Greece between 1815.
First of all, let's try to figure out, well, I mean, what the colors and flags represent. I'm guessing the color red means either direct occupation or war, so that's why you got Germany, Austria, France, and Russia. And when you have the British flag, is either like a small scale invasion, or where, for example, in the case of Croatia, it was just like an island. In the case of, he said Bosnia or Serbia, I don't remember, but like the RAF bombings. So it's not really like a true invasion or taking over the country. I do know that the red territories are, I guess, it's like direct occupation. So that's why you have like northern Germany, Hanover, southern Austria, and all of these France that has been occupied historically. But yeah, I'm guessing what the colors means, but if it's different, and maybe he explains this in the description, I don't really know. Well, let's figure it out later. But yeah, give me a like for that, guys.
And 1863 before they gave them back. While
By the way, guys, if you would want to support my channel, there's a link on the description for a new TikTok marketing class that I uploaded to Skillshare, talking about Skillshare. So if you would like to support this channel, I would appreciate if you check that out.
Bulgaria was invaded and almost entirely occupied by the British Army between
Yeah, okay.
1818.
Yeah, he mentioned darker color is occupation, lighter color is invasion, and the flag. It might be that when the country was part of other countries, right? So, for example, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Ukraine were part of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. So maybe that's why they have the flag. Spain, not entirely sure. I mean, the current form of Spain didn't exist since like what, 14 something out. So before you had either different Muslim caliphates or like kingdoms of Castile, Leon, Aragon. So
In 1919, at the end
maybe
of World
that's
War
it.
I,
I still have to
Cyprus
figure
was
out the
British
flags.
protectorate between 1878 and 1914, when they decided to just outright annex it to piss off the Turks, and it remained annexed until 1960, except for two small chunks that are still British today. Turkey itself was massively invaded by the British during World War I, and part of it was occupied between 1919 and 1923. That wraps up Europe, so let's move on to
That wraps
Asia.
up Europe. So I'm guessing he's only counting like the hostile invasions, because British troops were on Greece was it the Second World War? Yeah, it was in the Second World War. So I guess he's not counting that. Look, Switzerland, as always. Portugal as well. We don't see it on the map, but wasn't very. Poland, Czechia and Slovakia, Slovenia. A lot of places here didn't got invaded by Britain. Sweden, as well, he didn't mention. Norway, Denmark. I mean, he mentioned the union of Denmark, Norway, but I don't see either a flag or a color. Maybe he just forget and it's an editing mistake. But there should be like a flag.
Between 1919 and 1923. That wraps up Europe, so let's move on to Asia next. Modern-day Israel and Palestine, as well as Jordan, were British-controlled from the end of World War I to 1948 and 1946.
All right, darker color.
Lebanon and Syria were both occupied from the Vichy French government briefly during World War II. Iraq was ruled between 1919 and 1932 and invaded again during the Second World War, and again in 1991, and again in 2003. Kuwait was a colony for over 60 years until 1966. Georgia and Azerbaijan were both invaded and occupied right at the end of World War I for a year. Iran has been invaded at least 3 times.
With the Soviets,
The most notable example of the joint Anglo-Soviet invasion of 1941. Turkmenistan was invaded
A lot
in
of times,
1918
wow.
to prevent Bolshevik influence from spreading any
They really
further.
like Persia.
Afghanistan is a favorite British invasion spot since it's been invaded in 1839,
Of course.
1878, 1919, and again in 2001.
Wow, we always hear, or at least here where I live in Mexico, that the Americans invaded Iraq and Afghanistan. But let's not really forget that the British also took part in Iraq and Afghanistan. So if you're British or someone who knows a little bit more about the subject, write about either your experience or what do you think? Because honestly, I had I guess maybe it has to do with NATO, I'm guessing. So that's why they count it as like a British invasion.
Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, and Oman were all controlled by the British until the early 1970s, while a chunk of Yemen was controlled for over a century between 1839 and 1967. India,
No Saudi
Pakistan,
Arabia.
Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka were all, of course, invaded many times and
The
outright
crown
ruled
jewel
by
of the
British
empire.
in parts for nearly 2 centuries between 1757 and 1947. Nepal was invaded in 1814 but never successfully conquered. Bhutan was invaded in 1772 and again in 1864
Oh, wow.
and was sort of conquered as a protectorate between 1910 and 1948. Burma/Myanmar was invaded in 1826 and was definitely successfully conquered and ruled through 1947. Thailand was briefly invaded in 1945 since they were allied to Japan in World War II, and so was Vietnam in the same year, but that was to support the French government against the growing independence movement. Malaysia and Singapore were each conquered and ruled up until the 1950s and 1960s. Brunei was conquered and ruled up until the 1980s, whereas the Philippines were briefly invaded during the 7 Years' War. China got invaded a lot, and Hong Kong was a colony until as recently as 1997.
China was a favorite
and while
spot.
not outright invaded, part of Japan was occupied following World War II between 1946 and 1952. And finally, Indonesia was invaded a bunch during the Napoleonic Wars since it was a Dutch colony aligned to France at the time. Next up, Oceania. Australia and New Zealand, of course, were invaded by the British and established as colonies that each gained independence in 1931. Papua New Guinea was also a British colony for a time, as were the island countries of Fiji, Kiribati, the Solomon Islands, Tuvalu, and Vanuatu. Let's move back over to Africa next.
Oh,
The
man.
British have
There's gonna be a lot on this one as well.
In terms of just places the British outright colonized after invasions, there's the Gambia, Sierra Leone, Ghana, Nigeria, Egypt, Sudan, South Sudan, Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, Zambia, Malawi, Zimbabwe, Botswana,
Look at
Namibia,
all of
and
those,
South
man.
Africa, along with parts of modern-day Somalia and Guinea. Senegal was briefly invaded and had some of their coastline taken over in the 1700s, while during the Second World War, the British invaded the French colonies of Djibouti, Madagascar, and Comoros after they aligned
North
themselves with
Africa
the
as
Nazi
well.
Vichy regime, and the Italian colonies of Libya, Eritrea, and Ethiopia, although they had also invaded Ethiopia much earlier.
And let's not forget, I don't think this is either the full story because, for example, like the British attacked, I don't know, I don't remember if it was one or multiple French bases in like Algeria, for example. So he's not counting that. So if we were counting like British military action, there would probably be even more countries than just these.
In 1868, and as
Or maybe he's gonna
right
mention.
before World War I,
I
the
don't know.
British also invaded Togo and Cameroon without annexing them afterwards. For the final area of the world left to discuss,
Ooh,
let's
the
move on to
Americas.
All of Canada was a British colony until 1931, while Newfoundland remained until 1949. The United States, of course, was a colony until 1776, and was invaded again in 1812.
The
and
War of
northern states
1812, yep.
Oregon and Washington were claimed right up until 1846. As far as other outright British colonies here go, there was the Bahamas,
Belize.
Jamaica, Belize, Grenada, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Barbados, St. Lucia, Dominica, Antigua and Barbuda, St. Kitts and Nevis, Trinidad and Tobago, and Guyana. Besides colonies, Cuba was invaded and occupied during the 7 Years' War in 1762. Haiti was invaded in 1793 during the French Revolutionary Wars. The Dominican Republic was invaded way back in 1655 in an attempt at conquest under Oliver Cromwell. Parts of the east coast of Honduras and Nicaragua were conquered and ruled for nearly 2 centuries until 1819. They sent the Navy to invade
Hey.
Mexico in 1861 to force them to repay some debt.
Yeah, this was a joint invasion by Spain, France, and the UK. Basically, we were a mess at that time. We just had a civil war, sort of, between liberals and conservatives, and we just had our war with America. We lost Texas and California and a bunch of other states, and so we were wrecked. We were a mess of a country, and the president at the time had wanted to put like a 2-year moratorium on the debts, because we ran out of money. We were broke, dude. So we're still broke, but at that time it was really bad. So, the Europeans didn't like it and invaded. The French had ulterior motives and ended up pushing like a massive invasion. And so the British and Spaniards sort of retreat. But yeah, it's an important part of history. Britain invaded Mexico.
And during the splendidly named War of Jenkins Year, aka the more lame-sounding War of the Austrian Succession, the British invaded a lot of Spain's colonies, including Panama, a huge one into Colombia, and ultimately Peru. In 1796, the British took over Suriname because it was a Dutch colony, and they were allied with the revolutionary French and later Napoleon. They also invaded Martinique and Guadeloupe because they actually were French during the Napoleonic Wars. Venezuela was invaded in 1902 as part of the so-called Venezuela crisis to force the country to repay some debts they had defaulted on, kind of like Mexico, while Argentina and Uruguay were both invaded during the Napoleonic Wars as well in 1806 when Spain and her colonies were still allied with Napoleon. And that pretty much sums up all of the territory the British have ever ruled and all of the countries the
Jesus
small
Christ,
has
man.
ever invaded. There are a total of 65 countries today who celebrate their independence days from the British Empire.
Whoa. 65, man. That's all. Wow. I would have loved if instead of countries, like you mentioned, the population, because when you take into account India, Pakistan, Nigeria, South Africa, Egypt, these places have a lot of people, and when you add them up, we're talking about billions. So I would have liked that he mentioned the population instead of the countries, but
the empire used to rule over a quarter of all the world's land at the same time and was the biggest empire in human history.
Sad Britain.
And in total, today, there have been 117 modern countries that have been aggressively invaded by the British armed forces during some point in their histories, representing a total of 60% of all the world's nations, which is almost the same number of countries that you can watch this video in.
Jesus,
YouTube is
dude.
available in 130 countries now, or about 2/3 of them. But the algorithm that YouTube uses won't always work the way you think or want it to. It determines which...
The YouTube algorithm sucks, but alright, I think that is it. Wow. If you're British, I really wonder, how do you feel about this? About seeing this map and seeing your country involved in all continents and pretty much, well, like you mentioned, 60% of countries out there. Do you feel proud, or if it's a source of embarrassment, or you're kind of neutral on the whole thing? I'm kind of neutral. It's like, it happened a long time ago. The British legacy, it's very, very vast, especially when you consider the English language, for example, as a sort of universal world, global language. And a lot of cultural things, like countries that drive on is it the left side of the road? I really struggle with the right and left sides. But, drinking tea, a lot of countries love drinking tea thanks to the United Kingdom, and so many more things that I'm forgetting. But anyways, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. Please don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to the channel for more content. And again, I would really appreciate if you supported my Skillshare link in the description. I'll see you in the next video.